Good evening. According to a treasure trove of never-before-seen emails, which were just released earlier today by Republicans on both the House Oversight and House Judiciary Committees, well, they show that Dr. Fauci knew that COVID may have been intentionally modified and leaked from a lab over in Wuhan. Meanwhile, according to a new study which was just published over in Nature magazine, researchers there found that the T cells that your body naturally develops when fighting off the common cold, they can actually cross-protect you against COVID as well. And then lastly, during a recent TV interview, the director of the CDC, she admitted that over 75% of the people who died from COVID after being fully vaccinated had at least 4 other underlying health conditions as well. Let's go through it all together. This is your daily Facts Matter update, and I'm your host, Roman, from the Epoch Times. And now let's begin today's discussion by talking about Dr. Fauci's emails. So just earlier today, the Republican leaders on the House Oversight and House Judiciary Committees, they released excerpts of emails which they say reveal how Dr. Fauci knew that COVID may have been intentionally modified and leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Specifically, in a letter that they wrote to Mr. Javier Becerra, who is the Biden administration's Secretary of Health and Human Services, these lawmakers, they pointed to a conference call that took place on February 1st of 2020, in which both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins were on that call, and the topic of discussion was the virus's origins. Here's specifically what they wrote in this letter, quote, "It was on this conference call that Drs. Fauci and Collins were first warned that COVID-19 may have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and furthermore may have been intentionally genetically manipulated. It is unclear if either Dr. Fauci or Dr. Collins ever passed these warnings along to other government officials or if they simply ignored them." Now, actually, we did discuss this conference call that took place on February 1st in much greater detail on an earlier episode of our program of Facts Matter. That episode was published on December 23rd of 2021, so just a few weeks ago. If you want to check it out, I'll throw the card up in the top right corner above. But this letter to Javier Becerra, it gives a pretty good summary of what took place. Here's what it says, quote, "Only 3 days later, on February 4th of 2020, 4 participants of the conference call authored a paper entitled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 and sent a draft to Drs. Fauci and Collins. Prior to final publication in Nature Medicine, the paper was sent to Dr. Fauci for editing and approval. It is unclear what, if any, new evidence was presented or if the underlying science changed in that short period of time, but after speaking with Drs. Fauci and Collins, the authors abandoned their belief that COVID-19 was the result of a laboratory leak. It is also unclear if Drs. Fauci or Collins edited the paper prior to publication." And so the way that this letter summed up the happenings is very accurate. I really appreciate how succinct it is, because what basically took place is that on February 1st of 2020, there was a large conference call that had several medical experts from different countries, including Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, who were on that call. And during that teleconference, there were 2 presenters, both of them scientists, who presented the possibility that in their mind, the virus had leaked from a lab in Wuhan. That's what those 2 scientists said. That's what they presented. However, it was always strange that just 3 days after that teleconference on February 4th, so February 1st was the teleconference, and then February 4th, they published a paper called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, and that paper, it actually pushed forward the natural origin theory while almost completely dismissing the lab leak theory. And so these emails, they shed light on the fact that Dr. Fauci, he was actually sent this paper prior to publication, and he was asked to edit it. So then the next paragraph in this letter goes on to say this, quote, "On April 16th of 2020, more than 2 months after the original conference call, Dr. Collins emailed Dr. Fauci expressing dismay that the Nature Medicine article, which they saw prior to publication and were given the opportunity to edit, did not quash the lab leak hypothesis, and asks if the NIH can do more to, quote, put down the lab leak hypothesis. The next day, after Dr. Collins explicitly asked for more public pressure, Dr. Fauci cited the Nature Medicine paper from the White House podium, likely in an effort to further stifle the hypothesis that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology." In short, Dr. Collins was saying that even though prior to publication, they were able to edit this article, they did not go far enough. So the proximal origin article, even though it pushed forward the natural origins theory of the virus and essentially sidelined the lab leak theory, they didn't go far enough. He said they should have basically outright dismissed it altogether and said that it's not even possible. That's what the implication here is in these messages. However, you might look at this and you might have a very forgiving attitude because you might say, hey, Roman, you know what? Dr. Fauci, in editing this article, maybe he was privy to some information that we are not, and that's why he was able to outright dismiss the lab leak theory and promulgate the natural origins theory. However, according to this new trove of emails that were just released, that appears to not be the case. Here's again what these Republican lawmakers who are sitting on these committees wrote to Mr. Javier Becerra, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Quote, despite Dr. Fauci claiming otherwise on multiple occasions, he was, in fact, aware of the monetary relationship between NIAID, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, EcoHealth Alliance, Inc., and the Wuhan Institute of Virology by January 27th of 2020. Dr. Fauci also knew that NIAID worked with EcoHealth to craft a grant policy to sidestep the gain-of-function moratorium at the time. This new policy, designed by EcoHealth and agreed to by NIAID, allowed EcoHealth to complete dangerous experiments on novel bad coronaviruses with very little oversight that would have otherwise been blocked by the moratorium. Furthermore, there is also evidence that Dr. Fauci was aware that EcoHealth Alliance was not in compliance with the terms of the grant that they were using to fund the research over at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Here's what the letter goes on to say, quote, in January of 2020, Dr. Fauci was also aware that EcoHealth was not in compliance with the terms of its grant that funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology. EcoHealth was required to submit an annual progress report to NIAID by September the 30th of 2019 and had not yet done so. The committee subsequently learned that EcoHealth failed to submit these reports, presumably to hide a gain-of-function experiment conducted on infectious and potentially lethal novel bad coronaviruses. Now, on that last point, that's not necessarily news because we already knew that a few months back that those reports were not being submitted. Even Dr. Collins, the head of the NIH, had to come out and admit that the EcoHealth Alliance was failing to submit these reports. But when they actually did surface, they did show that there were gain-of-function experiments being conducted. So we already knew that. But what this trove of documents shows is that Dr. Fauci was aware, and then the big question is whether he was actually reporting this to his own superiors. Here's what the letter goes on to say, quote, by January 27th of 2020, Dr. Fauci knew NIAID had funded EcoHealth. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was a sub-grantee of EcoHealth, and EcoHealth was not in compliance with its grant reporting, in particular, a grant that NIAID knew had gain-of-function potential on novel bad coronaviruses. It is unclear if Dr. Fauci reported any of these issues to his superiors. We need to know the entirety of what Dr. Fauci knew and when he knew it. And then lastly, at the bottom, the authors of this letter have a list of 7 questions that they would like Dr. Fauci to answer in order to, as they say, prevent any future pandemics from occurring and to help in any future pandemic responses. And then after this letter to Javier Becerra, they have a bunch of the actual emails, some highlights, as well as, of course, some redactions. I'm going through them now. By the way, the reason I'm in the sound booth was because these emails published pretty much as soon as I sat down to record the episode today. So I had to take a bit of time to actually go through them for myself. I'm still going through them. One thing I do want to mention is that I'm seeing a lot of messages come to me personally right now about the Project Veritas emails. So I just want to make super clear. So these emails were released by ranking members of the House, of basically Republican ranking members of the House. However, these are totally separate from the Project Veritas emails that were released late yesterday on Monday. And those emails are pretty explosive. I've been going through them as well, and they're pretty bombshell, pretty explosive emails. However, we here at the Epoch Times have not been able to independently verify that those emails came from DARPA, because those emails, according to Project Veritas, they came from DARPA, and they have some pretty bombshell allegations in them if they're true. But we here at the Epoch Times, before we do any kind of reporting on them, we just want to make sure, we want to check all the boxes, make sure we do our due diligence, and before we tell you what's in them, before we do a deep dive and see how they fit into with all the other emails that we've gotten so far, in this case with Dr. Fauci, whether they are actually accurate. Because, I mean, to be honest, in this space, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of misinformation, and then there's a lot of disinformation. And so, you definitely want to do your due diligence before you believe anything blindly. So we're doing that before we before we report on them. However, in regards to these emails here, I think they're pretty interesting. They're definitely never before seen, and what they do is that in and of themselves, there's no like big bombshell in here, but they do shed more light on the happenings that we know have been going on behind the scenes with all this subterfuge between the NIH, the NIAID, Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, and these other government officials, how they're essentially stifling scientific debate behind the scenes of scientists who, say, are questioning the natural origins theory, who are looking into the lab leak theory, etc., how they're working behind the scenes to stifle those debates, and how it appears that there's a lot of connections between Dr. Peter Daszak, the EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Fauci, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and frankly, I mean, looking into this, I just wish there was more transparency in all this, because even with the emails that we get, as I'm reading through them, there's a whole bunch of things that are blacked out, that are censored to civilians like you and me, and so we're still not getting the full story. But with enough things coming out, perhaps we'll be able to piece together all the puzzles. And also, if Dr. Fauci actually does have to answer these 7 questions at the end of this letter that the ranking members of the Committee on Oversight and Reform and the ranking members of the Judiciary Committee that they're requesting him to answer, maybe then we'll get more pieces of the puzzle with which to figure out what's actually happening behind the scenes. Otherwise, until then, Roman in the studio, back to you. If you'd like to read more about these new findings, including these emails, if you'd like to read the full stack of emails in their entirety, I'll throw the links to all of them into the description box below this video for you to check out. And all I ask in return is that you take a super quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And now, let's move on over and talk about T cells. According to a new study, which was just published over in Nature magazine, researchers found that the T cells that your body produces when fighting off the common cold actually cross-protect you against COVID as well. Now, this study, it was conducted by researchers with the Imperial College of London, and it was funded by the National Institute for Health Research, as well as the Medical Research Council. And essentially, what this study suggests is that if you have fought off the common cold, then during that process of your body actually fighting off that infection, it developed T cells. And those T cells can not only help prevent a future cold infection, but also it can help to prevent infection from COVID as well. Here's specifically what one of the lead researchers wrote in the summary regarding their findings. Being exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus doesn't always result in infection, and we've been keen to understand why. We found that high levels of pre-existing T cells created by the body when infected with other human coronaviruses like the common cold can protect against COVID-19 infection. And then likewise, one of the other lead researchers, he said that the study, quote, provides the clearest evidence to date that T cells induced by the common cold coronaviruses play a protective role against SARS-CoV-2 infection. These T cells provide protection by attacking proteins within the virus rather than the spike protein on its surface. He then added that this new discovery, meaning that these T cells actually attack the proteins within the virus rather than just the spike protein on its outer shell, this could help to develop new versions of the vaccine, which could actually help to protect people against new variants as they come into being. Here's specifically what he said, quote, the spike protein is under intense immune pressure from vaccine-induced antibodies, which drives evolution of vaccine escape mutants. In contrast, the internal proteins targeted by the protective T cells we identified mutate much less. Consequently, they are highly conserved between various SARS-CoV-2 variants, including Omicron. New vaccines that include these conserved internal proteins would therefore induce broadly protective T-cell responses that should protect against current and future SARS-CoV-2 variants. Now, it is worth noting that these researchers did mention at the very end of their analysis that in their opinion at least, people should still go out and get the currently available COVID vaccines instead of just relying on protection from their T-cells. They noted that many of the colds are not actually caused by coronaviruses and that further research is needed on this matter. Regardless though, if you would like to read this full study for yourself, I'll throw a link to the full version of it into the description box below this video. And all I ask in return is that if you haven't already, take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And now, before we move on over and discuss the comorbidities that are found among people who have died from COVID, well, I would like to take a quick moment and introduce our sponsor for today's episode, which I will do from the sound booth. That's right, Roman. The sponsor of today's episode is an awesome company called American Hartford Gold. As I'm sure you're aware, the rate of inflation right now in this country is accelerating like crazy. I mean, everything from the cost of lumber, cars, houses, food, gas, everything is increasing at an accelerated pace. However, in my opinion, what the most amazing aspect of the system is that you can take this money, which I actually think is as fake as monopoly money because the Fed and the Treasury just print this out of nothing, and you can use it to buy real money from American Hartford Gold, which is gold and silver coinage. Take a look. This is a box that I get every single month from American Hartford Gold sent to me because I believe it's a great hedge against inflation. This is something that has had value for 5,000 years. It's had value across the world in Russia, China, America, India. I mean, this is the real stuff right here. This is a beautiful, actually Canadian maple. And this is right here is some silver coinage. I don't know if you can see how shiny and beautiful it is. Yeah, but I just get these every single month because I believe that unfortunately the US dollar will eventually fall as the global reserve currency, as sad as that is. And I just want to hedge against those people in Washington, D.C. continuously printing our prosperity into oblivion. And I would highly recommend that you do the same. Go on over to the website for American Hartford Gold and consider doing business with them. They're an awesome company. They sponsor a program like ours, so they obviously care about the truth getting out there, but they also have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have a great customer support staff when you call them. They're super friendly, and they make the entire process super simple. Because not only can you get these packages here delivered directly to your doorstep, but you can call them up and set it up so that you can actually get gold and silver directly deposited into your IRA account, again, making it all super simple. And right now they're offering a special to viewers of Facts Matter, where depending on how much you buy, how much gold and silver you buy, they will throw in $1,500 worth of free silver on your first order. So give them a call at 866-242-2352 or text Roman to 65532. Also, I'll throw a link to their website down in the description box below. And American Hartford Gold, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode. Now Roman in the studio, back to you. And now let's move on over and talk about the CDC. So 4 days ago, there was a rather surprising interview over on Good Morning America. Specifically, the director of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, she came on the air, and while speaking about people who have died from COVID after being fully vaccinated, she said that an overwhelming majority of these people, in fact 75% or over, had 4 or more comorbidities. Let me just repeat that. While discussing people who have died from COVID after being fully vaccinated, the director of the CDC, she admitted that over 75% of them had at least 4 other comorbidities that led to their death. And then naturally, here's what she said as a follow-up to that statement. So really, these are people who are unwell to begin with. And yes, really encouraging news in the context of Omicron. This means to not only get your primary series, but to get your booster series. And so, we here at the Epoch Times, we reached out to the CDC for comment on that statement, and they got back to us via email saying that Dr. Walensky was referencing this recent study here, which was published over on the CDC's website on January the 7th. And this was a fairly large-scale study. It actually looked at over 1.2 million people who had gotten fully vaccinated between December of 2020 and October of 2021. And that study found that 78% of the people who died from COVID after being vaccinated had at least 4 other underlying health conditions. And then furthermore, that same study also found that in all the deaths, the person had at least 1 other risk factor as well, meaning a risk factor other than COVID. Now, if you've been actually following these types of developments for a while now, for the last, let's say, a year and a half to 2 years, then frankly, this is not really new news for you. However, the fact that it's now being openly discussed on mainstream TV news, well, that is a big change. However, here's where things get a little bit complicated. Because some people, they actually misconstrue what Dr. Walensky said during that interview, taking it to mean that 75% of all COVID deaths in the entire country had at least 4 other underlying health conditions. And so, for instance, you had posts like this coming out on Twitter. The CDC director just said over 75% of COVID deaths occurred in people with at least 4 comorbidities. Since Biden can't shut down COVID, suddenly all this data is getting shared publicly. However, that's not what she actually said, because if you watch that full Good Morning America interview, she was speaking exclusively about those who are fully vaccinated. But here's the thing, that raises the very next logical question, which is, what percentage of the overall COVID deaths had underlying health conditions as well? In other words, when you look at all COVID deaths in the country, and all COVID deaths in all of America, among those who are both vaccinated and not vaccinated, what percentage of them had other underlying health conditions? And you would assume that after 2 years of collecting non-stop data, the CDC director would have that readily available off the top of her head. However, when she was actually asked about it 2 days ago over on Fox News, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, she attempted to dodge the question altogether. Specifically, when she was asked directly about whether or not the CDC had a breakdown of the comorbidities that Americans who died from COVID had, well, here was her answer. With Omicron, we are following that very carefully. Our death registry, of course, takes a few weeks to collect, and of course, Omicron has just been with us for a few weeks. But those data will be forthcoming, which is, quite frankly, a very nice way of saying almost nothing. However, that does not mean that we can't find the answer ourselves, because if you head on over to the CDC's official website, you can peruse over to the weekly updates report, and there they have a table which lists the comorbidities of people who have died from COVID. And that table, it lists all of the COVID deaths in the entire country among those who are both vaccinated and not vaccinated. And then right above that table, here's how the CDC summarizes their data. Table 3 shows the types of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in conjunction with deaths involving coronavirus disease 19, or COVID-19. For over 5% of these deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned on the death certificate. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 4 additional conditions or causes per death. So take a moment to take that in. Only 5% of the over 800,000 deaths had only COVID listed as the cause, meaning that 95% of the deaths had at least one other cause listed as well. And in total, as that summary mentioned, the average person who died from COVID had an additional 4 causes listed on their death certificate. And so, to see what those other comorbidities actually are, you can simply rearrange that table to go into descending order, and here's what you find. 49% also had either influenza and pneumonia, 39% also had a respiratory failure, 18% also had hypertensive disease, 15% also had diabetes, 12% also experienced cardiac arrest, 10% also had respiratory distress syndrome, 10% also had renal failure, 10% also had heart disease, 10% also had sepsis, 8% also had chronic lower respiratory disease, 8% also had vascular and other unspecified dementia, 7% also had cardiac arrhythmia, 7% also had experienced heart failure, 6% also had other diseases of the circulatory system, 5% were obese, and so on and so on. The list just goes on and on and on. And do remember that these are not mutually exclusive, and the average person had a total of 4 of these causes besides COVID. And so an individual might have had diabetes, renal failure, hypertension, pneumonia, and then also they had COVID. However, it is worth noting that this data does not mean that only 5% of these people actually died from COVID. It just means that in most cases, people who died had other health complications as well, which were likely exacerbated by COVID-19. But the silver lining here is that perhaps now, since the mainstream media narrative appears to be shifting, with many news outlets now actually reporting on things like how obesity is linked to COVID complications, well, maybe now there can be a real discussion in this country around Americans' overall health. I guess only time will tell whether that will actually come to fruition. Regardless, though, if you'd like to read any of the data that we've discussed so far, such as the CDC data surrounding the deaths of the vaccinated individuals, or if you'd like to peruse that CDC table where it lists out all the comorbidities, I'll throw all that into the description box below this video for you to check out. And again, all I ask is that if you haven't already, take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And now lastly, if you haven't already, subscribe to this YouTube channel in order to get this type of honest news content delivered directly into your YouTube feed while YouTube still allows it. Also consider hitting that notification bell so you can actually be notified of any new videos as we release them. And then lastly, consider subscribing to Facts Matter Clips. It's our new clips channel where we take each of our episodes and we publish each of the individual segments as a separate video over on the Clips channel. That makes it much more easier to share with your friends and your family. That link will be right there at the very top of the description box. I hope you click on it and subscribe to the new Clips channel. Then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed and stay free.